I'd like to thank Stuart and thank IAFOR. I've got a PowerPoint that will go with the talk. For those of you who have not followed recent Japanese politics, or really global politics in Asia, there have been attempts by the Abe administration to amend the Japanese Constitution, particularly Article 9, which deals with pacifism. And I'm going to talk a bit about that. What I see as potentially the bigger threat in terms of constitutional reform is actually the intent and attempts to amend Article 96, which is the article that involves amending the Constitution. So the Abe administration failed pretty heavily to get the support it needed to directly amend Article 9. So the attempts more recently have been to amend Article 96. If Article 96 is amended, it becomes very easy to change the Constitution, and that puts at risk not only the pacifist provision, but also freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, freedom of association. And these are things that, when we look at the history, going back to what many people are afraid Abe's looking back at with something of a revisionist view, it wasn't just militarism that was the issue. It was an inability to dissent. Those who didn't agree with what was happening under the Meiji Constitution, the prior constitution, if they spoke out, they were thrown in jail. If they refused to, even if they supposedly had religious freedom under the Meiji Constitution, this is the old constitution, if they did not openly support or at least accept the support of state Shinto, they were thrown in jail. Buddhist monks were executed. And in fact, Shinto priests were executed for refusing to follow state Shinto. So there was this older view, this older constitutional view that Abe's administration has been somewhat revisionist about, forgetting the negative parts or trying not to teach the negative parts of that history. That all becomes, I'm not saying they're going to go back to executing monks, and I mean, nothing like that, but the attacks on freedom of speech, and potentially fiscal support for certain brands of nationalist religion are real risks if Article 96 is amended. I'm going to start the talk with a little bit of background, because I'm going to assume that most of you haven't really studied the Japanese Constitution in so much depth. So I'm going to go through a little bit of the history of it. We'll talk a little bit about Article 9, the pacifist provision, but then I'm going to really turn to the topic of the talk, which is concerns about freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of association, and freedom of religion that could be at issue if the Constitution's amended. So first of all, you should be aware, one thing the Abe administration has said that is absolutely correct is that the current Japanese Constitution was imposed on the Japanese people by the United States. That one of the few historical facts that I've heard from the Abe administration that is absolutely 100% correct is that. What they fail to mention, however, I've never heard Abe or a cabinet minister mention this, is that over the many years since then, the freedoms in this originally imposed constitution have become central to the success of Japanese society and have been very heavily accepted by the Japanese people, to the point where the Japanese courts and the Japanese people have made these rights very much consistent with Nihon no Bunka, with Japanese culture. And so what we have is a constitution that was originally imposed by the United States. This is one of the grounds that the Abe administration has used to support changing the Constitution. But what they don't mention is the fact that many of the rights in the Constitution have been interpreted in light of Japanese culture and society. So it's become, over time, very much a Japanese constitution. And I always like to use the example from a case I spoke about last year called the Ahemi Tamaguchi case, which is a case the Japanese Supreme Court decided in 1997 involving visits by local officials to the Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo. These were officials from Ehime Prefecture. And the visits and the offerings they offered Tamaguchi were found to be unconstitutional, but they were found to be unconstitutional based on a test that looked in part at how the Japanese people would view this government action and whether or not it supported religion from within Japanese culture. So the court used the term Nihon no Bunka. And in fact, it's based on an earlier, this test is based in part on an earlier case that came out the other way involving a municipal gymnasium and not a national Shinto shrine, but a local Shinto groundbreaking. The court upheld that as being consistent with Japanese culture. I had some criticisms of that earlier case last year. We're not going to go there today. But it's really interesting that the Japanese court itself, and in this case, Ahime Tamaguchi, the court says, I'm going to use the English. I'll assume most of you probably have some background in Japanese, but even when I read a Japanese Supreme Court opinion, I have to have a research assistant translate it for me into kana. I can't. The kanji's so hard because they use these kanji that are very uncommon. So the best way to put it in English is they say, the Japanese Supreme Court says, we have to be mindful that while this Constitution was imposed on us, it is ours now, and we have made it something that is central to this society. And therefore, protecting the rights of freedom of religion, and essentially they use the term seiji to shukyo no bunni, which is separation of politics and religion, as opposed to separation of church and state, which is the American context, but the very Japanese concept. And they said that this is sort of core to Japanese values. And so this bit that Abe's correct about they never address this. What they do is they go directly from this was imposed and it's out of step with today's geopolitics, where China might be a threat, North Korea might be a threat, and where Japan may need the ability to defend itself in a global community. A lot of it's based on the fact that, and this isn't even our own, we need a Japanese constitution. Abe said that. We need a Japanese constitution. Of course, the Japanese Supreme Court has said this imposed constitution has become a Japanese constitution. And in fact, the majority of the Japanese people, in fact, a wide majority, support keeping the Constitution exactly as it is. So that's really interesting, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a bit. I want to talk first about constitutional continuity. And this is something, for those of you from countries with constitutions that are easy to change, I want to start out by saying there are real benefits to that too. There are benefits to a variety of constitutional systems. I'm going to focus on the benefits of constitutional continuity, which is a system like the US and Japan, a number of other countries as well, Australia, and a number of other countries have this sort of constitutional continuity. What this is a system where it's really hard to amend the Constitution. So in Japan, as we'll see in a moment, in order to amend the Japanese Constitution, 2/3 of each house of the Diet, the upper and lower house, must vote to amend the Constitution, and then it goes to a referendum to the people of Japan. And a majority of the people must support the change, or else it does not pass. It makes it very hard to amend the Constitution. It's even harder to amend the US Constitution. You need 2/3 of each House of Congress and then 3/4 of the states in order to amend it. But the Japanese Constitution is still pretty darn hard to amend. And one of the reasons these systems, this sort of a system exists, is that Constitution's viewed as a fundamental law that gives rights that are supposed to be above daily politics. So we had the experience in the US after September 11th of people, the government just violating the Constitution regularly. And yet we had courts saying, no, this is unconstitutional, this is unconstitutional. Why? Because even though the political hot button issues at the time suggested a climate that would allow violations of certain fundamental rights, the Constitution transcended those politics. Now, I'm not saying people didn't get away with things. I'm just saying the Constitution was there as a bulwark against that. And what the goal of a fundamental right is that short-term political arguments can't easily affect the fundamental law. So in Japan, where the Japanese Supreme Court makes a decision, it only applies to the parties before the court. It's not, in the US, it sets precedent for everybody. The Japanese Supreme Court, the Saiko Saiban, the Japanese Supreme Court issues a decision. Lower courts will follow that decision, most likely, but it's really binding on the parties before it. But in a case where fundamental rights are involved, that's important, because that means that when someone's fundamental rights are violated, that they have some redress under a constitution that's hard to amend. If political moments became the defining thing for constitutional values, things like freedom of religion or freedom of speech in most countries would be overridden regularly. Things like protection from illegal searches and seizures and so forth, which is, by the way, very fundamental in Japan. There's not supposed to be illegal searches and seizures, and the Japanese Saiko Saiban has regularly sanctioned police departments that have done this. So, there are certain things that are supposed to be above political, daily political problems. But if something's important enough to meet the requirements for amendment, it's likely a central value. So if Japan supported as a nation getting rid of Article 9, okay, if there was support and the Japanese Constitution were amended, what it says, if the Constitution's hard to amend, is that these central values are widely shared by the Japanese people, and therefore amendment makes sense, right? Right now, I don't think you could get certainly couldn't get 2/3 of the lower house. I doubt you could get 2/3 of the upper house. The new Komitai parties threatened to leave LDP if there was an attempt. That's the ruling party. Abe's party is LDP. But they need a coalition. And their coalition partner threatened to leave if they amend Article 9. And public opinion polls show somewhere in the area of 72% of the Japanese people do not want an amendment to Article 9. So it's clearly not central to the Japanese people to amend this. But if it became central, then we could see amendment to a fundamental law, but it doesn't happen that often. However, fundamental laws may be interpreted by judicial and other political branches. And Japan has a concept called sankenbunitsu under the Constitution. Sankenbunitsu. Sankenbunitsu means separation of powers. And under the Japanese system of sankenbunitsu, of separation of powers, all three houses, all three parts of the government, the executive, the prime minister and cabinet, the legislative, the diet, and the judicial branch, have the power to interpret the Constitution. However, when there's a conflict, the judicial branch's decision will govern that conflict, unlike in the US, however, only as to the parties before the court. In the US, it's binding on the whole nation. In Japan, it's only binding on the parties before the court. But as I said, courts tend to follow what the Japanese Supreme Court does. What we've seen
in the Article 9 context is that the Abe administration has reinterpreted the Article 9. So they've now interpreted Article 9 to allow a much stronger self-defense force, so that there's much more military hardware. There's the ability to engage in what some people might call offensive action so as to be defensive, so as to protect the country. However, when we look at this reinterpretation, it certainly doesn't get rid of Article 9. Some people have questioned whether or not this reinterpretation itself that the Abe administration has engaged in is even constitutional. In other words, this is the language of Article 9. Does it exceed this language? I'm not on the Japanese Supreme Court, so I don't get to make that call. But I would suspect that the Japanese Supreme Court would uphold the majority of what the Abe administration has done in this reinterpretation under the context of Sanken Bunitsu, that it is up to the executive within its powers to make these interpretations. But I think if they go one step further, if they go to the step where there is sort of defensive becomes pretty clearly offensive, I think at that point, one element of Sanken Bunitsu, of the separation of powers, is the check. I think at that point the court steps in and says, this is unconstitutional. You can't do that. And since the case before it would be the executive's interpretation, that would be unconstitutional. Oh, this is well and good. There's been lots of media attention to it. Article 9 is probably safe for now. In fact, even if Article 96 were amended, given public opinion, at least in the short term, Article 9 is probably safe for now. I think there is something far more scary that the Abe administration has been engaged in, and it does not directly involve amending Article 9. This is so boring that most people overlook it. This is the kind of thing that makes constitutional law people like me all excited, and makes normal people with normal brains that haven't been polluted by law school go to sleep. And Abe's administration, these are smart people, okay? They understand this. So their incredible failure to amend Article 9, in fact, despite rolling back freedom of speech over the last 4 years, as I'm going to talk about, Japanese public opinion has even become more against amending Article 9. The focus has been on amending Article 96, which is the article that is about amending the Constitution. In other words, they want to amend the amendment article. And that sounds less controversial. The idea, the way the administration sells it is, well, we need to have more of a Japanese constitution, so the Japanese people need to have more of a say in this, so we need to make it easier to change the Constitution. We're not going to touch Article 9 now, but we need to change Article 96. That's the article that requires 2/3 of each house and a majority of the Japanese people to pass a constitutional law. So if this gets amended, now the door is open. Many people feel that the first move will be a move against Article 9, to change Article 9. I think the public opinion is so against that, at least if there's any sort of public referendum involving a majority, that's not going to pass. But the door would be open to amend other provisions of the Constitution, including Article 19, freedom of conscience, Article 20, that deals with religious freedom, and the concept of Seiji Toshiki no Bunni, which is just fancy Japanese language for separation of politics and religion. I like the Japanese term much better than the American term, separation of church and state, because the Japanese term has more of a practical reality to it. But, you know, I can't sell that to my American colleagues because they don't speak Japanese, and the subtlety to that is kind of lost in English. The freedom of speech and association, this is my biggest fear right here, Article 21. Article 23, academic freedom. And then Article 89, which prevents government funding of religion. You know, those of you from other parts of Asia are probably very well aware of this. Those of you from Japan are certainly aware of this. And many of you from other parts of the world may be aware of this. But, you know, to listen to even modern politicians from other countries talk about militarization in Japan, it's a discussion as though it's all about Article 9, that if Japan becomes militarized, that's the end, that's it, it's just going to be World War II all over again. But when you look at what happened from the 1880s to the 1930s, it wasn't just about militarization. It was about nationalist authoritarianism. It was about a lack of dissent. The Meiji Constitution, which preceded this Constitution, made many promises, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, and it realized none of them. Well, maybe for the Meiji's first 15 years. By the time of the Taisho era, under the way the Constitution was, if you had dissent, if you spoke out against the emperor or against the military, you could be arrested. If you did not respect state Shinto, and there were Shinto priests who viewed state Shinto as state Shinto was the government sort of run Shinto. Some people call it emperor worship, which is really not accurate because Shinto has always had a small element of that, but that was mixed with clan as well as aspects of animism. Shinto is a very complex religion, but state Shinto was not so complex. It was government, central government run Shintoism. And you know, people were arrested, were killed for opposing state Shinto. Freedoms of speech, there was no free press. If you wrote an article critical of the government, you would be in jail, or at least you wouldn't be working anymore. You know, there was no questioning. That, combined with militarization, was what led to a lot of what happened. So, if you think about it from a revisionist historical perspective, if you believe that Japan was not in the wrong back then, as Abe does, if you believe that people should be united behind a strong military, as Abe seems to, the best tool you have is suppression of freedom of speech and freedom of the press and freedom of association. And you can also use it to pander to nationalist elements by funding religion, but only certain religion. This is the door that could be opened under Article 9. Those sorts of things can be sold very easily. We see it in the US all the time. Acts that are supposedly supposed to promote religious freedom or promote freedom of speech that actually have limiting effects. The non-aptly named Patriot Act, which had a huge chilling effect on speech in the US. But in Japan, more recently, there has been the Government Secrets Act, which has had a chilling effect on freedom of the press and freedom of speech. In fact, without any constitutional amendment at all, without touching Articles 21 and 19 directly, Japan's ranking for freedom of speech and press has fallen heavily since 2012. Coincidentally, when Abe took office. And by the way, I'm not Japanese. I'm not saying that you shouldn't vote for whoever you want to vote for. I'm talking about this as a constitutional law person who's concerned about free speech and freedom of exercise. So it's not a critique of Abe like a Japanese citizen has the right to critique. This is a critique from the outside. I'm not one of those American scholars who believes that America is always right. In fact, I'm probably one of those who believes we're usually wrong. But just because it's fun to believe you're wrong. But the reality is, I think it's essential to understand that Japan's place in the world of free speech is not where it was 4 years ago, 3.5 years ago. Japan has fallen 37 spots in 4 years, from the top 20 well out of the top 50 for freedom of speech. Some of that is based on the government secrets law, but most of it actually is based on a lot of other things that have been going on behind the scenes. Lots of other pressures. Funding for media outlets have been pressured. Other things have been done that have caused angst among editors of newspapers. And then you have the recent State Secrets Act, which allows whistleblowers potentially to be jailed, and under very extreme circumstances. The Western media has blown this out of proportion. Under very extreme circumstances, members of the media could be jailed for reporting on whistleblowing. But not just because you report on it, you have to actually solicit it and facilitate it in a very significant way. So when we look at this is scary. This is scary. If there's a change to Article 9 in light of this, there may be a fear of speaking out, a fear of exercising your freedoms as a Japanese citizen or as a member of the press, a member of the media. If Article 21 is amended, a lot of the people who are speaking out publicly in the media and online who could conceivably be sanctioned would lose their voice. The one great thing, and it just is such a wonderful statement about the Japanese people in this very tumultuous era, protests are not that common in Japan. Widespread, large, huge, big protests. There's something in Japanese society, the wa, the idea of group culture, getting along as a group. So widespread protest is something that you don't see that often. In fact, several years ago, the government raised the use tax 8%. No one was out in the streets, or very few people were out in the streets protesting. If the United States government did that, there would be riots in the streets. But there have been widespread protests against the Public Information Act, the Media Secrets Act. There have been widespread protests against amending Article 9, changing the pacifist provision. And there have been widespread protests supporting freedom of speech. But the biggest protests have been to prevent a change in Article 9. And this says something really great about the power of freedom of speech. The 100,000 people who gathered in Tokyo to protest the Abe government's intent to change Article 9 might not feel so free to do that without robust freedoms of association and speech and conscience that they currently have. Now, bear in mind, there are real problems. My colleague at Kanazawa Daigaku, Kanazawa University, Koji Higashigawa, has pointed out that in the Japanese Supreme Court, there are serious issues with limiting freedom of speech, but still not the kind of limits on public protest that could be problematic in opposing these other potential amendments. So the slippery slope, I don't think there's much of a concern. I talked about the slippery slope for amending. You know, we say in law, slippery slope is once you open the door to something, it gets worse and worse and worse until it finally you reach sort of maximum dysfunctionality or maximum, the biggest problem that you could conceive of from a given point. When we look at the freedom of religion, I don't think there's a real threat, as there was during the Meiji era, to free exercise. Japan has one of the strongest, I talked about this last year, one of the strongest protections for the free exercise of religion, probably because it's not incredibly religious, which allows more room for religion to coexist with secularism and other religions. Japan's, I would say, it's not even in the top 50. I think it may have just fallen out of the top 60 in freedom of speech, but it's in the top 10 for free exercise of religion. But that's not really the concern. The concern is this concept that I mentioned of seiji toshu nobuni, separation of politics and religion. The concern is that we have an administration that is overtly promoting historical revisionism in schools, that's pandering to nationalists who are not a big percentage of the Japanese population, but vote. 98% of nationalists vote, much bigger percentage than of any other group. So we've got a concern about maybe funding of something like Yasukuni indirectly, or funding of nationalist religious groups in the guise of funding, veterans of war. Past administrations have funded families of war veterans quite appropriately. But the Abe administration has teetered on the brink of sometimes crossing the line into funding specific shrines. They haven't crossed the line. They have not crossed the line. But there's that potential risk if Article 89 were to be amended. Again, all of this goes back to that really boring, puts everybody to sleep but us con law people, attempt to amend Article 96, amending the amendment procedure. That is what could lead to all of this. However, but there's hope. There's always hope. I always like to end with hope. The greatest hope is the Japanese people. The Japanese people have been remarkable in doing something that is not common in Japan. Speaking out. And not just on the internet, not just anonymously, but speaking out in widespread protests, speaking out in op-ed pieces, speaking out in, at least as long as they can, newspapers, and on TV shows, entertainment figures who work for these big entertainment companies that are somewhat in bed with the government. Corporate officials, same thing. They're speaking out against changing the Constitution. So people who might otherwise be seen as likely to support government action are speaking out against what they fear will limit Japanese freedom and Japanese pacifism, which these individuals view as central to Japan's success. These are many individuals who view Japanese success has been remarkable since World War II in economics, in the arts, in entertainment, and so forth. And many people, unlike Abe, who look back to the military past, are looking at these elements and are concerned. Some, including LDP, co-members of the LDP party, are concerned about defense spending, taking money away from other economic spending, and so forth. Polls show overwhelming opposition to changing Article 9, and this is only increasing. The Japanese people have shown incredible resiliency on this. This is what's a little bit scary, though. The Abe administration, again, these are smart people. I think it's very bad when people sort of just caricature them as crazy nationalists, because they may be nationalists, and some of them may be crazy, but I don't know. But the reality is they've realized they've lost the battle to directly amend Article 9. The new tactic is to try to amend Article 96, and this is a direct quote from Abe, to re-educate people about what they consider to be history and constitutional reform. This could have impact on Article 23, academic freedom. They've been working hard to amend what little is left of teaching the negative aspects of this World War II and pre-World War II history in primary and secondary schools. And teachers, I think, are fearful that they may be less able to teach this material as time goes on. And it could even reach into the universities, although that hasn't thankfully happened yet. So I don't want to paint too negative a picture. First of all, Abe could be out of office, who knows, anytime. But, you know, who the hell knows? I mean, it's politics, right? And the reality is, for all the lack of transparency his administration has had on these things, they've been remarkably transparent about economics. And that's really why they're in office. The Japanese people didn't elect Abe because they agree with his crazy nationalist ideas. They elected Abe because they thought he could help the really bad economic situation and get out of a very, very bad economic plight. And he's actually having some limited success with that. So we'll see what happens with that. People often vote with their pocketbooks. So we'll see. We'll see what happens with that. So that was just I know that was like a lot of information in a really short time. So what I want to do is open it up to questions, and I'll also stay after to answer more questions, if you have them. But we'll open it up. We've got about almost 7.5 minutes for questions.